certain sounds, like school bells, make you feel anxiety? Or does the thought or even the sight of foods that once made you sick still make you feel nauseous? These kinds of automatic responses are a part of classical conditioning, a type of learned response. Today we're going to start by taking a look at learning and behaviorism with classical conditioning to see how it impacts our behavior and our mental processes. So first, let's establish what the behavioral perspective is. The behavior perspective is a field that, when formed, focused only on observable behavior. In fact, they didn't even want to discuss the mental processes because they believed the only thing that should be studied is what we can physically see. Today, there is a cognitive aspect to behaviorism, but we'll take a look at that a little bit more later. Let's talk about classical conditioning though. The field was actually founded by a physiologist, not a psychologist, by the name of Ivan Pavlov, who found that over time in an experiment on dog salivation, the dogs could salivate at the sound of footsteps or eventually the sound of a bell, even when food was not present. What he found was that through classical conditioning, you can take a stimulus, something that was previously neutral, and you can condition someone to have a physiological response or an automatic response to that stimulus. That's known as now a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response. So in Pavlov's case, for example, we start with a neutral stimulus, a bell. That on its own might get a dog's attention, but it doesn't cause any type of physiological response. When paired over time with the sight of food, dogs learn to associate that bell with food coming, and the food is what makes them automatically salivate. By continuing those two pairings over time of the bell with the food, eventually on its own the bell becomes a conditioned stimulus and the drooling becomes the conditioned response. Association is what happens during that classical conditioning, where the dog or any organism starts to associate that neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, the presence of the bell and the presence of the food that is naturally going to cause the response of drooling. Acquisition is what happens once classical conditioning has become successful. If the bell on its own is now enough to cause the dog to salivate, we now have a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response. Acquisition has taken place. Classical conditioning is referred to as associative learning because we learn when certain events occur together. It also happens in operant conditioning that we'll talk about in the next video. So to recap, in classical conditioning, we start with an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response, like dog food and a dog salivating. The conditioned stimulus would be the thing that was originally neutral, the thing that through associative learning, you start to associate with the unconditioned stimulus. In Pavlov's case, that's the bell. They're going to associate with the unconditioned stimulus of food that causes the unconditioned response of salivation. Eventually, with that acquisition, the neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus, so now the bell itself is enough to make the dog salivate. After conditioning has taken place, we can see a wide variety of different behaviors that can emerge. In some cases, extinction will take place. If you continue to ring that bell over time without ever giving a dog food, eventually there's no more association. The presence of that bell does not mean that food is coming, and so the ringing of the bell no longer causes a conditioned response. Once that's happened, we say that the behavior has become extinct. Once a behavior is extinct, however, sometimes it can come back. And if it comes back out of nowhere, one day you ring the bell and the dog starts drooling, that's referred to as spontaneous recovery. Doesn't happen to everyone, but every once in a while we do see it, and it's a unique phenomenon in classical conditioning. Stimulus discrimination is what happens when only a specific conditioned stimulus is enough to elicit the conditioned response. So if you use different types of bell tones, for example, but only one will make the dog salivate, that is known as stimulus discrimination. For other cases or other organisms, they might generalize, where not only that bell, but other similar tones can also cause salivation to take place. We don't always know why some people will discriminate while others will generalize when it comes to classical conditioning, but again, they're both phenomenons that we can see. Some other interesting aspects of classical conditioning include things like higher order conditioning, which is almost like a secondary classical conditioning that can take place. Let's say, for example, a classical conditioned response of fear of the doctor has taken place, where the pain of getting a shot is now being paired with the sight of a doctor, so the doctor now is enough to elicit fear. As time goes on, however, you might notice that at the pharmacy, that person also wears a white coat like a doctor. Someone with higher order conditioning might start to develop a fear response when walking into a pharmacy, even though it has nothing to do with the original classical conditioning experience of being in pain when going to a doctor. Other research has indicated that counter-conditioning can take place as well, so we can actually reverse conditioned responses when necessary. This is something that we'll see more when we get into therapy of psychological disorders. Because if we want to change a behavioral response, we can use counter-conditioning for that to take place. For example, if a child has a fear of heights or bridges, by giving them a lollipop or a piece of candy every time they go over the bridge, we're creating a new association, a new positive response to going over that bridge to replace the negative response in order to create a new classically conditioned response. And taste aversion is another classical conditioning event that takes place when pairing food that makes somebody ill with sickness can create a classically conditioned response that thinking about or seeing that food is enough to make a person feel ill. Or if they try to eat that food again, even if they have no reason to become sick, they might still become physically ill as a result of that taste aversion. Taste aversion often follows the rule of one trial conditioning, where you don't need multiple pairings. Eating something once, one time, and getting sick is often enough to have a strong classically conditioned response where you might never want to eat that food again. This has to do with biological preparedness, which suggests that humans and animals are predisposed to learn these associations for survival reasons. We wouldn't want to continuously try to eat something over and over again that could make us sick, so instead we learn to reject that food quickly so that we don't end up in the same dangerous situation again. Not all classical conditioning is permanent, however. We can become habituated or used to a classically conditioned response so that we have less of a response as time goes on. Think about how that first burst of a firework might make you jump, but each repeated one that follows, you have less and less of a response to until you no longer have that fear response associated with it. And while classical conditioning is an automatic response, we can also see our behavior being shaped by rewards and punishments, which is called operant conditioning. We'll take a look at that one next time. Until then, remember, be kind to your mind.